So my name is Jeff Carpenter. I'm the CEO and founder of Cavio Learning. I've been in the learning space now for over 20 years, doing everything from instructional design to learning strategy. So my co-presenters today, we have Rich Burton, who is with Microsoft. He is in charge of L&D innovation at the Services University. So he has been really using and utilizing cognitive science-based learning principles to be able to help drive innovation inside of Microsoft Services University. He is also just recently in 2015 won the Brandon Hall Award for Innovation in Training. We also have from Ford, Gail Hasley. She is presently developing the innovation operating system inside of Ford. She has been really a recognized leader not only within Ford, but also has worked for Pepsi Company, as well as working in various aspects of labor relations and organizational development. And then last we have Rob Lauber. He is currently the CLO with McDonald's and Hamburger University. He has previously worked with Yum Brands, been CLO of Yum Brands, and was the CLO of the year in years past. So what is innovation? This year we've heard a lot really about what is innovation, and a lot of people really focus on innovation as being something that is, everybody tilts towards technology. It's implementing new technology. You hear that a lot, but really it's important to understand really what the core definition of innovation is. It's really looking at an existing process, procedure, something that's being done, and really coming up with looking at it through a different lens. So coming up with a new idea, a new device, a new method to be able to drive change, to make things better, to innovate on existing things. So it's not always around technology. So it's important to realize as we kind of go through this. Innovation is really seeing patterns where others see noise and blindly pushing forward. Taking the time to look back and identify the patterns is what we really associate with some of the greatest inventors in our time, and really to be able to innovate business moving forward. Steve Jobs really said it during commencement speech. He said, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, or whatever. This approach has never let me down, and it has made all the difference in my life. So it's important that you take the time to really kind of look backwards and really identify what those patterns are telling you. So when you start to look at your data, you start to look at the information, you start to look at your reports, really what are the common threads that are in there, stripping out the noise and really identifying what are some of the key patterns that you can identify to help you really drive things forward. Richard Branson has a mantra that he runs through all of the DNA within his companies. He talks about the ABCD, which is always be connecting the dots. And it's really the ability to listen and the willingness to stick your neck out and ask obvious questions that are criminally underrated business essentials. Why are we doing this? Not accepting really what the norms are that are currently out there. Really the biggest difference between being innovative and being everyone else is really seeing those dots and connecting them, while others ignore them or don't ask questions or explore any of them and are just accepting of the status quo. So really, you have to ask, how do we connect the dots? A couple of things that you want to think about. One is, don't accept the world as it is today or it was yesterday. So you always have to be questioning, why are you doing things the way that you're currently doing them now? What are the dots that others missed? What are the ones that are commonly being ignored as part of a long-term norm? So people that just, when you ask the question, well, why are they doing this, people shrug and say, well, we've always done it this way. The question is, well, why? Is there a better way to be able to do what you're doing? You have to really be comfortable with the uncomfortable. When you start to project forward, you start to think about what the future is what would the new world look like? So if you could take what you're currently doing and completely go with a clean slate, what would that new world look like? And you have to also understand there's a little bit of a mad scientist that you have to have inside you, because you have to understand that not everyone will see what you see. So you have to be able to help explain to them what that new reality looks like and really how to get there and what that means and why it's better than where you're currently at. And you have to be able to be willing to change everything to make a better reality. So you can't really stay within the current constructs that you're within currently. You have to be able to look outside of those and say, let's remove all of those constructs. Let's remove all that red tape so that you can really make your better reality come to life. So what are the sources of those dots? So we talked about the dots here just a little while ago. There's really kind of four things. There's your intuition, there's the abstract connections, there's the dreaming of potential, and there's creativity. So from the intuition, when something just doesn't feel right or doesn't look right, people talk about from their gut, it just doesn't feel right to me. That's usually a way for you to start to kind of dig in a little bit into those areas. Abstract connection, so applying different thought to an existing solution. Dreaming of potential, so what are the ideas and dreaming of what is possible? So it's not what is impossible. You shouldn't think of things as saying, well, that's not probable, we can't do that. You have to be able to take the time to say, well, what is possible? What could we be doing now? What could be done differently? And really, creativity is looking at things, we often talk about inside of Cavio, looking at things through a different lens. So everybody kind of looks at a problem a certain way, but lifting yourself away from it and looking at it from a different perspective through a different set of eyes will help you be able to identify things that aren't quite right or should be done differently. So innovation is identifying the dots that conventional wisdom has failed or is unwilling to see. In India, there was a healthcare system that is committed to low insurance coverage. So if you have no insurance or low insurance coverage, they would bring people in and provide them with all of the health care that they could. One of the things that they identified is that within their group that did heart surgery, what they identified is that they could only get done about 5 surgeries a day. And they were trying to find ways to be able to make it so that it was less expensive, because it was costing about $50,000 to do a heart bypass surgery. And how could they get more throughput so they could service more patients more efficiently at a lower cost. What they did is they found out that a bypass surgery typically takes about 5 hours. And the critical part, which is the actual grafting, usually only takes about an hour. And that's what the specialist does. So of that 5 hours, the specialist is really only needed for their specialty for about 1 hour within that 5 hours. The other things of like opening and closing the chest, suturing, and other procedures could be done by junior doctors. So what they started to look at is saying, well, what if we did this more of kind of like a manufacturing process? The surgical team or the specialist could move from operating room to operating room to operating room in a more mechanical process. So they laid it out almost like they were doing lean manufacturing with patients. They looked at that problem differently, and what they found is that they could perform more surgeries. It only cost them now $5,000 per surgery to get it done. And they were able to do now about 24 to 25 surgeries a day, all really by just looking at their process differently and innovating on something that most people didn't really look at and just accepted the norm of what was going on. So I use this example outside of L&D to say you can use concepts from other areas and really look at what you're doing internally differently. So how do you create a culture of innovation? You have to look at it almost as like a scientist looks at it. So innovation is really, you have to create a culture of innovation. So you have to have and remove any type of disincentives to innovation. You have to let your team experiment and fail and really be able to celebrate those failures because you have a lot of learnings that come out of those. You have to allow them to be able to really creatively look at problems, come up with creative solutions, and really start to innovate on each of those different things. You also want to make sure that you fail fast. So you don't want to take a long time to be able to identify that something is not working. So you want to be able to get to a certain point and understand it works or it doesn't work, and if it doesn't work, why doesn't it work? So that you can then start to really learn and celebrate and learn from those failures. You have to be able to kind of play, well, what if? So you have to do the what if game. Well, what if we did something differently? What if we approached something from a different angle? What if we did these things? And you have to be able to be open with your teams to be able to talk about those different things. You also need to then take the time to really strengthen the innovation muscle. So you have to use it on a regular basis. This can't be something that you kind of pull everybody together once every 2 or 3 years to say, now we're going to innovate today. You have to be able to look at your organization on a regular basis and say, how can we continually do things better? And it has to be okay. So the reason why I have Edison up there is he wasn't really the first one that created the light bulb, or the only one. There were up to about 20 other inventors who also came up with the incandescent light bulb prior to Edison's version. He's really the one that is credited with it because he was able to outstrip earlier versions because of a combination of really kind of three things. He had an effective incandescent material, so he used a better material in there, so he innovated on the material. He had higher vacuum. He was able to achieve inside the bulb, which made it so that it burned brighter. And the resistance that made the power distribution from the centralized source more viable, more economically viable. So he took an existing invention and really innovated on it and became the one that we know of as that created the incandescent bulb. But it's important to realize that he failed almost 3,000 times before he came up with the light bulb. I'll leave you with this. There was a magazine writer that came to Edison, and he asked him, he goes, "Isn't it a shame that with the tremendous amount of work that you have done, you haven't been able to get any results?" And Edison turned back to him and says, "Results, my man, I've gotten lots of results. I know several thousand things that won't work." He was using the things as failures as ways to start to identify what actually worked. So when he said something didn't work, then he would start to look at what would work. I'm going to pass it over to Rich from Microsoft. So Rich is going to discuss a little bit about innovation in the L&D space within Microsoft. So Rich, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. What I wanted to start with was a quick question to the audience. But what do you think are some of the key elements of innovation? Perfect. Having time to think. I definitely agree with that one. Freedom to explore, need to change. All of these things Jeff has talked about. Curiosity, pushing the envelope, love that. Imagination, definitely back to the creativity part. And then the benchmarking, I think, is a good one because that kind of starts to get into the first element that I wanted to talk about. So thanks for the responses here. I think this is awesome. I think you guys are thinking about this the right way. So the first thing that I actually wanted to talk about and how I think about innovation is the use of experimentation. And Jeff had mentioned this before. And experimentation might seem like an obvious thing when it comes to innovation and a lot of people, I think, will claim that they do it well. I know that I thought that when I first heard it in the context of innovation, and then I realized that I didn't. But I've learned a lot, and I want to share that with you. So let's dive into this really quickly around this concept of experimentation. How many times have you heard this statement? We're good at experimenting. We pilot things all the time. You know, I've heard that a lot at Microsoft, and I know at Microsoft we actually pilot a lot of things, and I feel like we're actually pretty good at it. But the question is that the same thing as experimentation? And as a true innovator, I like to answer that question by asking three different questions about that. So first, if you're thinking about a pilot, some things to think about. How long is your pilot? How many people does it affect? And what's the ultimate outcome? For the first one, the first question around how long is your pilot? If your answer is 6 months or a year, I would argue it's not an experiment. And that kind of goes back to Jeff's comment around failing fast. The nature of experiments is that they're quick and that they're cheap. If an experiment is taking 6 months to roll out, there is most likely a very significant amount of effort involved in making it happen, and that translates to cost. So when you think about experiments, think of them as very quick ways to get great insights without having to make a big investment. Experiments should be measured in days and weeks rather than months or years, and that's definitely one that takes a little getting used to. I know at larger corporations, we tend to think of pilots as running for six months or a year, and that's how we have to learn about it. But really encourage you to try and drill down to thinking about running experiments in the matter of days or weeks. Second question that I mentioned, how many people does it affect? This is the one that probably trips me up most of the time because it's so easy to make the assumption that the more people you have involved equals better results. And you know, while that may work for a pilot, it can actually work against you in an experiment. Knowing that the intent of an experiment is, you know, fast and cheap, Having 100 or 1,000 people involved can really slow things down, and it can increase costs. There are effective ways to do larger scale experiments, but from what I've seen, the insight that we get with 10 carefully chosen people is usually just as rich and powerful as what we've learned from a group of 100. And again, you're testing a hypothesis, right? And so a lot of times you can learn what you need to learn with a small group. And then finally, the third question that I asked, what is the ultimate outcome of a pilot? From what I've seen, most pilots are focused on success, especially if it's taking 6 months and using up time from hundreds of people. We want success. We want to prove that we're right and that what we're piloting can scale beyond a pilot group. Failure is often seen as in a negative light, and even though we may learn from it, but what it comes down to, kind of talking about the dreaded ROI, failure is a mark against you. And as Jeff was talking before, we need to change that culture. With experiments, because they're so quick and inexpensive, the focus is on gaining insight. Success and failure are treated with equal weight. Failures may result in new experiments that you can then use to test other hypotheses. And success can lead to taking an idea forward into piloting or doing something on a broader scale. The point is, with experimentation, insight is the goal. All right, so that covers the first point. Now I want to flip back to another poll question for you. And just thinking about your own workspace, if you go back to the website, I just want to get a sense of, if the people on this call, are you currently running learning experiments where you work? Kind of thinking about that kind of quick, fail fast way of doing things. So it looks like, a lot of, about 60 to 65%, it sounds like, are actually running these kinds of experiments at work when it comes to L&D. And I think that that's fantastic, because you can totally learn so much from it in a very quick amount of time. Cool, thanks for that. We'll go on to the second element that I wanted to talk about that I think is really critical when it comes to innovating in learning and development world, and that is remaining laser focused on the learner. And again, this may seem obvious. I think that's it is obvious, but it's something that that is easy to get away, that we let get away from us as kind of the business and budgeting and timeline pressures start to impede on what we're doing. All we know, we all know that this is the right thing to do when developing good learning experiences, but then how does that relate to innovation? For, much like agile software development, if you're in the software industry, or if you've ever heard of something called inclusive design, agile software development, inclusive design principles, they keep the end user in focus, and that can lead to really innovative solutions that spark user loyalty and fandom. I don't know if you've heard about this thing called Pokemon Go that's going on right now, but that level of craze really comes from looking at that user experience and what people are wanting to do. From an innovation and L&D perspective, many of our experiments are based on studies in cognitive science that revolve around how a person learns more effectively. That's what we use a lot of time to center on the learner. We also use tools like user stories and personas that we borrow from agile software development that clearly define who we're trying to solve the problems for. And then when it comes to the defining learning objectives, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, we write what we call action objectives that center on the action that we want people to take, instead of a more passive statement like we get a lot of the time. These are just some examples of the tools that we leverage to make sure that we're constantly keeping our users at the center and innovating around the problems that are important to them. What are some of the tips that you guys have for kind of keeping your training and your learning and development learner-centric? Are there tools that you use? Are there tips that you use? What do you find useful? Yep, including SMEs and curation definitely helps. One of the things that we've actually found is bringing learners in, so people that aren't SMEs, into the first development definitely helps, kind of get that perspective of somebody that's not a SME, but kind of having a mix of both helps. Interactivity, definitely. Interactive loops, action learning. I love all this stuff. These are all many concepts that you'll, again, if you kind of learned about cognitive science and how the brain works, you'll see these. So fantastic. I think some great ideas here. All right, going to move to the final point that I have, which requires us to show a cute puppy, which is always better. Eating your own dog food is what we say in the software industry. Basically means, actually use it yourself. I can't tell you how many times I've been to L&D conferences where industry leaders are presenting on the most effective and innovative ways to learn and retain attention, and then they do it using like passive, boring PowerPoint presentation. As an innovator, it's important to take these insights from your experiments and put them to use. Push the boundaries, even small ones, with the work that you do every day. I think Jeff had mentioned that innovation isn't always this big, bold, awesome idea. It can be in small increments, and it's really important again to take those insights and put them to use in the stuff that you're doing every day. And related to this, if you are applying what you know, have a thick skin, because you're going to be introducing disruption or different ways of learning, and I guarantee you're going to get negative feedback. Listen to it, intentionally incorporate it or ignore it, but keep forging ahead. People learn best when they're uncomfortable. What are some of the roadblocks that you think exist that prevent you from using innovative learning approaches where you work? I'm really curious to see what kind of common, if we're going to get common themes across kind of industries and geographies. Definitely budget and red tape. I expect to see that budget word probably come up quite a bit. Executive support, yep. Funding, time, money. These are all absolutely things that I think that we're all dealing with. And I think a lot of these topics we could probably take into the Q&A. So if you've got some things you want to ask about, take them into the Q&A session that we'll have at the end. But, I really hope that, I've given you some helpful tips in how you can kind of make innovation a core part of what you do in learning and development. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Jeff.
So next, we're going to have Gail from Ford. So Gail, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Okay, well, that's the problem with following Rich, is because I don't have a cool poll or a cute picture of a dog. But I do have 3 areas that I thought were really interesting because they were innovation from the ground up. So there's 3 grassroots initiatives that are happening at Ford, and I'm going to tie in some of the concepts that Rich just talked about as well. First I need to start with the business. The business here at Ford is not unlike many others. So we're trying to deliver on the core, but trying to figure out where our future is going to be, what our future strategy is going to be. We know we're going to be an automobile and a mobility company, and we need to be able to deliver on both, and we need to deliver innovatively in both parts of our business. And knowing that we especially because we're such a complex technical business, you can't necessarily buy off everything you need off the street, so those skills, so you also need to build. And so as we were talking about the business industry, we had to eat our own dog food as well. One of our managers said, you know what, Gail, I'd like to, after we talked about the business and we talked about the fact that L&D had to react much more quickly to the business, that our customers are really leaving us behind. They're creating their own web videos, and if you think about the internet, you just type in a Google search. When you think about the user experience, and we have ethnographers and sense making comes from Red Associates out there, where they study human behavior. We have a lot of fancy LMSs out there, but at the end of the day, people just want really good search. My 80-year-old father does a YouTube search to find out, all kinds of things and learn in just a couple minutes, and that's how people are used to learning. So we have to adapt our approach. And as we talked about it, we continued, even after talking about the business and the need for speed, we continued to act in the same way. We weren't eating our own dog food. One of our employees said, you know what, this reminds me of the travel industry. And so she did a presentation to the group to say, here's the correlation to the travel industry and L&D. And it used to be that people would go to travel agents. They would book travel. They were the SMEs. And very quickly, that's no longer the business model. That's no longer the paradigm. And so they drew the corollary between the travel industry and L&D, and it really got people engaged and talking about, well, what do we need to do within L&D to really deliver to Ford in the business today? And the process was, we used a process called a test track process, where all it does is say, all right, if you could break all the rules, test the assumptions. We have certain assumptions that you need a budget. You have certain assumptions that you need designers. You have certain assumptions about the fact you need SMEs. What if you tested those assumptions and then you pulled them back together into good ideas that are actually actionable? And that's what the entire L&D community did. And they came up with a series of actions on their own. And then I said, hey guys, we've got 50 great ideas here, but we can only action 3 of them. And so I allowed the organization to vote on the top 3, and they're picking them apart one by one, and then they're sharing them into a community of practice. The second piece of the innovation, because again it was grassroots, was you need forums to be able to share ideas. Even here at Ford, communities of practice sometimes have a bad connotation. We feel so guilty about attending a community of practice that's all about development for us that we tend to go for the task at hand in the business. And I think it's an HR archetype, or even an L&D archetype, where we want to serve our business customers, but we forget to learn ourselves. And so we put more teeth into a global community of practice. And we've made it, now this doesn't sound very cool, but we have made it an expectation that all of our L&D professionals attend these community of practices. And we've also made it an expectation that they share. And we do certain rewards and for those presenters or people online. And we also videotape them, because especially in a global business, it's really hard for everybody to access or to attend certain meetings at certain times of day. So now we have a library of topics, videos, presentations, outsized resource links. And for those employees who want to develop training on their own, we're enabling them through this partnership site. So they're able to get on and see at least some of the principles to how it's not just about a PowerPoint presentation, but how does learning evolve and what makes good learning, so that if they are going to do it on their own, we can help partner with them to do that and provide some tools and resources. And the last one, the third one, Techie Talk discussion forums. So we have an issue here at Ford where even though we're doing a lot more curation of content on the outside and relying on vendors and using companies like Cavio, we are also constrained, because we are such a functional technical business, that we need internal ISDs, and they're very hard to find on the outside. And even sources that we go to provide that expertise, it's a pretty hot area, at least in the Michigan region right now. And so we have challenged each other to say, all right, we need to follow what's happening in the company. We need to understand what's happening in the country or company, and realize that it's happening in our L&D community as well. We have to build. We can't just buy. And so how do we do that? And so we had one of our employees come up with Techie Talk discussion forums. So these are, they're voluntary, but they've been, I would say, over-resourced. And they have been wildly successful. They're global in nature, and people can come, and it's a place where people can literally ask questions. It's not a PowerPoint presentation, but they'll do a couple key principles of a technology up front, and then people literally practice together. And that's the real key. People can ask questions at their own pace. We've got a couple people in there that are sharing ideas, but they're learning from each other. And technology and the ability to handle technology really was when our ISDs went through and said, what are the barriers that are prohibiting us from moving more quickly and thinking more innovatively? Our own knowledge of technical expertise was one of those key areas. And although it's not on this slide, one of the red threads throughout Ford and innovation is really the focus on the end user. And so we're not just innovating for innovation's sake. We're really trying to innovate towards the customer. And so when we talk about things like ethnographers or sense makers or people who really study employee behavior, that's really helping us understand and really prioritize our resources and not make it our own assumptions about what the user needs and what the user experiences. So those are just some common red threads. And then I will mention that I completely agree with Rich on the experiments. We don't have it quite right, Rich, but we are doing some experiments and some traditional experiments. So, for example, we're going out and we're exploring things around performance ratings with control groups just to see what the user experience would be like, what the performance would be. We're experimenting with providing supervisor feedback and giving and receiving feedback, and the use of the tools associated and without the use of the tools associated, just to test quickly whether our own assumptions about usage of tools, technologies, and what employees really prefer. And so we're doing more of a quantitative and qualitative analysis and engaging employees much more in polling and survey results. And so again, it's much more focused on user-centric innovation.
Great. Thank you, Gail. I really appreciate it. So Rob, I pass it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks. Hello, everyone. And thanks for having me on here. And I get to bat cleanup, so these guys covered all of my slides. I just thought I would talk about sort of what's going on at McDonald's in that context and set it in a simple framework around how we're focusing on transformation, where our opportunities are really to transform and be innovative and innovate in our business. You know, overall from a business perspective, I think we're looking at the same similar three areas. The third one I might not call content, but it might be around product. But we are really focused around examining our business model, reevaluating our infrastructure, and then the third piece from an L&D perspective is our content. But I think from a business perspective, we would say we're looking at our food, the food that we offer, and the food that customers want in our business. So from an innovation perspective at McDonald's, we've really been looking at it from this perspective. And I loved what you had to say, Jeff, up front in terms of looking at things from a different perspective. I also think what's really helpful, and I think Gail even referenced it as well, is around comparing yourself to other areas. So forward looking at the travel industry, or I know in learning and development, frequently we look at, I think about other areas of the business like IT or product development and look at how they operate and what can I learn, or what kind of metaphors or analogies can I identify that we can bring to life in the learning and development, in the learning and development arena. For us on the learning and development side, we're looking at innovation around our business model. So we're looking at things like how are we funded and are we organized the right way, and what kind of structure do we need for us to be able to respond to the business and transform in the way that we need to move. So I know Rich in his last poll talked about barriers, and I think sometimes our business model can get in the way of innovation as well in terms of whether we're centralized, decentralized, a federated model, how we're structured, what we insource and what we outsource can be a driver as well from a business model. So we're really looking closely at those pieces from a learning and development perspective and saying where's our opportunities to think differently, come up with a different perspective, proceed on. Second piece is around infrastructure, and we're looking at innovation around our infrastructure as well. And infrastructure from a learning and development perspective, I'd say, is some technology, but it's also not only that, but just in the end, how do we enable people to access the learning that we're trying to enable in the organization? Is it from other people? Is it in a more formal, structured way? Is it in a peer-to-peer, shoulder-to-shoulder kind of way? Is it more structured experiences where people can learn on the job? What's our field training structure look like, and how does that help us enable learning in the organization? Or what does our learning technologies platforms and our roadmap look like as we go, and where are the opportunities for us to really innovate from a learning and development perspective, and are those infrastructures helping us innovate, or are they constraining us from innovating? And then the third piece is obviously on content. Rich made a comment about being learner-centric and helping people learn where they learn, where they want to learn, when they want to learn, and how they want to learn. And I think our content has to be engineered and structured and enabled to do that. So we're looking closely at what are the ways and listening to our learners in terms of, and looking at the environment, honestly, in a restaurant business, looking at the environment around where are the opportunities to learn and how can we make content specifically that people can have access to when they need it, where they need it, and how they need it, that's going to help them learn in that context. In our organization currently, we have one company, I would say, but we're decentralized on a couple of different levels. We're 80 to 90% and moving to 90% plus franchised. So we're owned by thousands of owners across the world. And then second, each of our countries operates a bit independently. So we have learning organizations across most of our major markets that operate somewhat autonomously in terms of the way they approach learning and development and meet the needs of their local market customers. So one of the things we've done around to try and drive some innovation and to look at different perspectives at solving the same problem is establish what we call global learning community. And I wouldn't say it's breakthrough, in the world of learning and development. But it is breakthrough in the context of what we're trying to do at McDonald's, and really, the goal behind it is to promote best practice sharing and to, drive adoption across markets. So we've done that, and out of it have come conversations around: are there opportunities for us to establish global standards for how we create content? How can we pivot from reinventing content across those autonomous learning organizations to more of an adaptation model? And we've started really simple, and that is we've started with monthly webcasts on topics driven by the community and what interests them, so that community of practice. And then we look at and try to showcase a key challenge in each call topic that we're going after. So we might have our Canadian organization talk about how they're trying to solve for the way we train the crew in our restaurants. And now we're in the process of establishing a SharePoint community, which will establish and keep the flow going and make it easier to connect outside of those particular calls. So really sort of growing that community and enabling more opportunities for that community to share ideas, hear different perspectives, and frankly learn from each other's experimentation and evolve as we go.
All right, excellent. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so what I wanted to do is ask a couple of questions. I'm going to throw the first one out to the group. So how do you get your teams to focus on innovation as part of their daily routine?
I think it really starts with just making sure that there is alignment to the business needs. And then as we sit down and we talked about in the design modes, recently the team just came up with a series of questions. So we call it formally here charter. It's really a series of questions to help folks really think about, answer a number of different questions before they even get started down the design mode. So instead of being takers of orders from customers in terms of training, which is what we've done, we've designed a series of questions so that our ISDs and our training managers can be more of performance consultants, so they understand those needs. That was an area that's not very innovative, but I think it's very essential to start the innovation process. And then through that, there's a series of questions an instructional system designer or a training manager needs to go through, and including what is that user experience, who's the end, who would be the primary user, who would be the end user, what's the real problem, can we curate the content, do we really have to build, buy, or borrow, what is the timing, can we improve the timing to deliver? Those are all questions that we're posing. Some of the skill teams are establishing some metrics in terms of their time to delivery, and that is challenging people to think differently about how they design training.
I'll just add, understanding that innovation is a change in culture, and you have to be intentional about how you change it. And so, changing behavior takes time. And so just making sure that you're doing some small things maybe to start, like creating a space for people to brainstorm and try and make those connections, creating a space for people to design kind of small-scale experiments, and just kind of getting their feet wet with some of that stuff. I think that that's really important to starting to kind of change the culture. And again, it does take time.
How does this continuous innovation impact your teams from a kind of a personal level? So, any type of change management, that kind of the feeling of not having a stable area to stand on. So how does that impact your team, and how do you help them kind of overcome that constant state of innovation?
I describe it as a continual effort in terms of trying to ground people on the notion, maybe more broadly, that change is a constant. From an innovation perspective, I think the opportunity is to help define what the future really is. So what are the ideas, what are the new ideas and breakthrough ideas that can help us evolve even further, which is, backwards into driving change then in how we operate as a function. So for me, it's, you can be in a bit of control of it by identifying new ideas and new opportunities, but B, setting an expectation that, we need to keep moving and we need to keep evolving and we need to keep looking for ways we can innovate in the organization.
I agree with Rob, and I think our responsibility is also, to Rob's point, is to expose our teams to as much of the external environment, not only in the world, but in L&D. So we need to continually make sure that we're not the only ones that are reaching out and establishing those networks, that our teams are able to do that too through a variety of resources. And then I think our responsibility as leaders is really challenging, just asking questions. I think that's our new role, is to ask the team questions, the why questions, the can we do it differently. That's, I think, what's going to continue to change the culture. And then we also have to challenge our own assumptions about budget, about business model. I mean, Rob's focusing on that as well. Our old business models and how we get funding. We're trying to challenge ourselves on that as well, because because our old business models, I can tell you here at Ford, don't work as well either.
How much do you do experimentation in the span of what you do on a regular basis? So how much time do you allocate towards allowing your teams to experiment?
Well, this is Rich. That's an easy question for me, because I'm lucky enough to have been the kind of created a position on the L&D team to focus on innovation, so I get to spend a lot of my time kind of focusing on that. But what I'm trying to do is really enable the rest of the team to do it by providing tools and guidance around identifying the experiments and running them. And one of the things that that we try and do to kind of get people to think about this as a different way of working instead of something additional that they have to do is just look at one of the problems that you're trying to tackle today that is you're going to do some work around it. Are there ways in which we can build an experiment into what you're already doing?
How do you have L&D use innovation to get ahead of the groups that you support within your organization?
I feel like that's an accountability for us as a learning and development function to be leading as opposed to trying to follow. So my context with my team is about how are we, A, holding nothing sacred, B, looking at consistently reinventing ourselves and what we have to offer to make sure that we're driving more value in the eyes of the people that we're trying to serve from a business context.
So for the last question, somebody had actually put in there that they would love to hear what the most fun innovation thing that you've done inside of your business.
I think one of the most fun has really been kind of, again, going back to the cognitive science approach that we've been using, and really kind of looking at some of the principles there and starting to do some experimentation with the concept of retention and fighting the forgetting curve. It's also fresh in my mind because we're running a couple of these pilots right now that the most fun part about this is kind of sitting down and designing this experiment where we did, we've got, I think it's about 50 people that are taking some sort of technical course, and we wanted to make sure that it wasn't a one-time event. We wanted to give them some retention ability after that. So we are piloting a little tool, a third-party tool, where we divided half of the group and kind of reinforced knowledge through some trivia questions with them over the course of the next 2 weeks, and then half of the group we didn't. And we're starting to get the results back on kind of going back and testing the whole group on what they've remembered, what they've retained, and just seeing the results from something as simple as that. We're looking at almost 20 to 30 points difference in terms of the amount of retention, and just kind of seeing those results, I think, is the most fun part. And then figuring out, okay, how do we make, we know it works, how do we make it work for everything else?
So for me, the most fun has been to just watch the teams come up with their ideas and actually implement them, and just creating the space in our quarterly meetings where they can have dialogue and discussions and talk about what everyone is doing. And then action some of those ideas has just been, the energy, I think, over the past few months has really changed because they're so actively involved in leading it. So whether it's this test track innovation process or just their thoughts around what they can do differently and how they add value to the business has been really energizing for me.
I think I would say that I would tie it to two things, really. One is we made a simple shift in a classroom experience that we had from being operationally focused to focusing on a leadership mindset, and it was a risk that we took, but it was amazing to watch the reaction of the learners who felt really elevated from an audience perspective, and the reaction from our owner-operators, our franchisees, in terms of how right on it was. And it was a bit of an educated guess, and it was definitely very different than what had existed before, and that was a big one. And then the second one, I think, is we're beginning to roll some tablet-based performance support, I guess I would call it, in terms of the platform for how we help crew learn in our restaurants. And that's been amazingly well received, and it's very, very different than any way that it's been done in the 60 years here. So it's exciting to see learners and sponsors get excited, and it's fun to see the team get excited about that feeling of accomplishment as well.